Some of you may know this story. This one's kind of dark. I'm going to read it directly from where I got it, something I've known about for a while, and I've done some investigation on it. Some of you people may have done some investigation on this as well. It's one of those things from back in World War II where we had some terrible people doing some terrible things, and this one actually happens to come from Russia. And in my investigation of this story, trying to find out if it's true or plausible, coming from, like I was telling Loki before, my scientific mind and my healthcare training, so I took it apart. I looked to see if the technology was available for the time. I looked to see if these type of people existed at the time or in the place that they said, if everything was set up to where this could actually be true. Everything is very, very plausible, but there are strong arguments on both sides that say this isn't true, and there are strong arguments that say this is true. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to read this for you, and we'll get into Loki's a little later, but realize the possibility of this being an actual story exists. And for you people who are in England, I hope it really doesn't bother your sleep too much, because this one's pretty disturbing. So, if you guys have ever heard me do my readings from my book, I'm usually in the morning when I read it. My eyes are better, my voice is better. So forgive me if I stumble, but I'm going to do my best because this one's a little long, and bear with us. And to those people who said hi to me in chat, and to Loki, hello everybody. All right, here we go. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas based on stimulants. They were kept in an isolated environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so that the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only a microphone and a 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized window into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, but no bedding, running water and toilets, and enough dried food to last for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners, which we all know what that means, deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversation took on a darker aspect after 4 days mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and the events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternating whispering to the microphones. And let me read that again. They stopped talking to each other and began alternating whispering to the microphones in the one-way mirrored porthole. Oddly, they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce an occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about his behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphone until the second and third captives started to scream. The two non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared pages after page with their own feces and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. Then the screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure that they were working, since they thought it was impossible that no sound could be coming from the 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen that 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get the attention from their captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke a response from the captives that they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to the test microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." I'll remind you, I'm just reading this the way it's written, sorry. To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for their life, or the life of a loved one, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that they were in as alive. The food rations past day 5 had not so much as been touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subject, his thighs and chest, stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 of the surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of the flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that wounds were inflicted by hand, not by teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the positions and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all four test subjects had been removed. This is one of those places where I did a lot of thinking about my medical research and the stuff that I had learned. Under certain circumstances, people can survive with their organs outside of their body, but it has to be certain circumstances, and this is what they saw. While the heart and lungs and diaphragm remained in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tracts of all 4 could be seen still working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of the days. Most of the soldiers were Russian specialist operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be let out of the chamber and immediately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back. The test subjects continued to scream and wanted the gas to be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed in the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. And I thought about that, and I'm thinking if their fingernails and their skin on their fingers had been removed down to the bone, it would be fairly easy for them to rip someone's throat out with their exposed bone. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count the ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of morphine and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one of the doctors. Okay, again, I gotta read this the way it's written. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out to the point there was no more air in his vessels. There was no more air in his vessel system. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach, and just repeated the words more, over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. Here's another one where I thought about having the heart stop. You can live without having that work if your brain has oxygen for 3 minutes, and it seemed like this is how it worked for this one. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begged for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back into his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had given him to prepare him for surgery. He fought furiously against the restraints with the anesthetic gas, though the anesthetic gas was brought up to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through the 4-inch wide leather straps on one of his wrists, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding his wrist was there. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under. And the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that had died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had triple the normal amounts of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to remain free from being subdued. Most of them were from the force of his own muscles that he exerted to set himself free. The second survivor had been the first of the group of the 5 to start screaming, his vocal cords destroyed. He was unable to beg or object to the surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, they try the surgery without anesthetic. It did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of placing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should not be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting in the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes caught hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of a dramatic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so that the patient could write his message. It was simple: keep cutting. The other two test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for during the operation. They had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period. Sorry, my eyes are getting weak. And they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas. One of them responded, "I must remain awake." All three subjects' restraints were reinforced and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of the military benefactors for having failed their stated goals of the project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential. He wanted to see what would happen if they put them back in on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed into the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. An EEG, of course, is to measure brainwaves. That was another one of the things that I had to investigate to see if they had anything that was adequate for the time, and they did. To everyone's surprise, all three stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back into the gas. It was obvious that at this point all three were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again, for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired to the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined unexpectedly. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the time and moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat line as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber, with both subjects inside, as well as three researchers. One of the named three immediately drew out his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to the bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped at the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. We are you. We are the madness that lurks within all of you, beginning to be free at the very moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal heaven where we cannot tread. The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out, "So nearly free." All right. Again, that one, we don't know if it's true or not. I've checked. I can't tell you if it's true or not, but it is awfully disturbing.